So if we have a diet that basically is inhibiting the formation or activity of AMPK, we're going to get a leaky gut. Now, what does that mean? It means microbial fragments can now enter our blood and cause inflammation.
Hello and welcome to the Wellness Zone podcast. I'm Mary Perry and I'm here with Dr. Barry Sears, and today we're talking about the gut microbiome. So Dr. Sears, how does it affect our diet and what's the real story here?
First of all, it's very, very complex, and people are basically led to believe it's very simple, which is not the case. That basically how the gut microbiome works basically is really a key to our future wellness. So let's start first of all, what happens? What happens when basically you apply science to understand what's happening in the gut? First of all, the gut is about 25 feet long. That's a big distance. And it's in really two parts. One part is called the small intestine, and the other is called the large intestine, also known as the colon. Now, in terms of bacteria, there are virtually no bacteria, no microbes whatsoever in the small intestine. Virtually all the microbes are in the colon. So when we talk about a healthy gut, we're really talking about the healthy of the gut colony in the large colon. So let's start basically, what happens when you actually eat food? Well, the first thing that you basically put in your mouth, and basically there are taste receptors on the tongue. And they're tasting for basically looking for dangerous things, usually things which are very bitter, like alkaloids. And if you get some food product that's very rich in alkaloids, a poison, what's the first thing you do? Pooey, you spit it out. That's your first defense thing. Don't let it get any further. Basically, bad things will happen. Now, on the other hand, we also have taste receptors that basically are set for sweetness. If it's sweet, it means it's safe. So that's why people always like to eat berries before they eat vegetables. Why? Berries are very sweet. They contain a lot of sugar. Vegetables are not very sweet. They contain very little sugar. So that's why we have a propensity for basically eating foods which are very sweet. Now, once we basically put the food in its passive taste receptors, then basically it's digested. Now, where it's absorbed are in different parts of this small intestine. If you're eating simple sugars like glucose and fructose, and remember, table sugar is really a combination of glucose and fructose, but it's broken down very quickly in the mouth. So those sugars are very rapidly absorbed into the blood, and they give rise to an insulin response. That's why insulin levels go up when you eat something sugary. On the other hand, fats are more slowly absorbed, and proteins have the slowest rate of absorption. They're more difficult to break down, but they're the most important aspect because if they're broken down and absorbed in the small intestine, they send signals through the vagal nerve directly to the brain saying, we're full now, you can stop eating. So you can imagine if you're eating a food that has very little protein and a lot of sugar, basically the signals will never get to the brain, and the brain says, keep on eating, we're okay here. It's sweet and it tastes good, and I basically so no reason to stop. So now we go to the second part, and basically what happens in the colon. Other things which are important in our diet are fermentable fiber and polyphenols. They are not absorbed in the small intestine, because they'd be broken down by microbes in the colon. So the fermentable fiber breaks down into what are called short-chain fatty acids. These are the source of nutrients for the cells in the colon to maintain viability. So if you're not eating very much fermentable fiber, guess what? The cells in your colon are not going to be very happy, and they're going to start to wither away. And that's when you start to get things like a leaky gut. Likewise, the polyphenols, they're not very well absorbed either, but there are microbes that can break them down and metabolize them into small phenolic fragments that can be absorbed. So you have two different parts of the gut. You have the colon and the small intestine. In the small intestine, your macronutrients are absorbed. In the small intestine, the fragments of the fiber and also of the polyphenols are absorbed.
So Dr. Sears, we hear a lot about a leaky gut. Can we talk a bit about that in terms of your overall gut health?
Well, remember the colon is basically split into two sections, the small intestine and the colon. The small intestine virtually, as I said earlier, virtually has no bacteria because it has residual oxygen. The bacteria that live in our gut hate oxygen. In fact, oxygen is toxic to them. The colon, on the other hand, is virtually devoid of oxygen. And now those bacteria are just happy as clams. So we really live in two separate worlds. Inside our gut, in the colon, we have no oxygen whatsoever. In our body, we need oxygen or we die. Now, that being said, what happens when basically there's how do we get a leaky gut? Well, basically the proteins that hold the gut together, those cells that line the gut, what controls that lining, the integrity of the lining, is AMPK. So if we have a diet that basically is inhibiting the formation or activity of AMPK, we're going to get a leaky gut. Now, what does that mean? It means microbial fragments can now enter our blood and cause inflammation. And once we have excess inflammation in the body, everything goes to hell in a handbasket. So our first line of defense against inflammation is having strong gut junctions, but that's only possible if we have adequate levels of AMPK being formed, and that's basically a functionality of the composition of the diet. Let's go back to carbohydrates, the simple ones that are tasty. The brain says, that's okay, eat more. Well, they're exactly the ones that have the greatest negative impact on AMPK activity. So if we have a high sugar diet, we have now more basically decreased levels of AMPK and basically encouraging a leaky gut. Now, how's it coming into when we talk about ultra-processed foods? So ultra-processed foods are what they are. We've taken the foods and breaking them down to its basic constituents and then reassembled them. Okay, not too bad. We do that all the time in terms of taking raw materials and breaking them down and making something useful. But in terms of cost, when you're basically breaking down and separating out the raw materials from foods, protein is very expensive. So if you have a food that has protein, basically I want to get rid of the protein, and because I have what's left behind, the cheap carbohydrates and the cheap fat, I can now add an unlimited number of chemicals that make them taste better. And that's why, again, when we talk about ultra-processed foods, it's not that basically we're tearing down and putting them back together again, but we're now using new chemicals which are not found in the food chain, to basically restore flavor, texture, and taste. And this is the problem with ultra-processed foods. Because these new chemicals, there's about at least 10,000. They're almost unregulated nuclear bombs. We really have no idea what they're doing, not only to our gut, but also to our metabolism. Now, we know a lot of drugs also basically cause havoc in our metabolism. Antibiotics, what a great way to basically make and harm our bacteria by killing them. That's what antibiotics do. But at the same time, these surfactants or other chemical emulsifiers used in foods, they can now affect our metabolism. Now, why is that important? Because metabolism has been crafted over millennia, hundreds of millennia, to basically keep evolving to make it as efficient as possible. So those 10,000 new chemicals which are used to make processed foods more palatable, last longer, more desirable, these are the ones that are now basically causing great havoc in our metabolism. And that's why we're seeing the data is quite clear. The more we have ultra-processed foods in our diet, we're getting sicker. And a new study said we're also becoming more addicted. Basically, there's a thing called the Yale Addictive Profile. And people who basically are large consumers of ultra-processed foods, they show addictive behavior. And also we know that basically in controlled studies, when people are given the same amount of foods, same composition of protein, carbohydrate, and fat, but one composed of ultra-processed foods and the other one being natural foods, they tend to eat more calories, about 500 extra calories per day. So as a nutritionist, if you're eating an extra 500 calories per day, what's going to happen?
You're going to gain weight.
Exactly. And so what we're seeing is the rapid weight increase in Americans is really a consequence of the disruption, not only of the gut barrier, but also from the standpoint of disruption of our metabolism. And that's the most scary aspect, because it's our metabolism that keeps us alive. It's our metabolism that basically allows us to be most functional. So, this being said, what's the future? Well, you probably have three options. One, Option one, keep doing what you're doing and pray for good luck. Well, praying for good luck is not the best way to go through and living a long life. And you can also pray that the drug companies will find some drug that has absolutely no side effects that will save you from yourself. Well, that's not a very good bargain. So option one's not too classy because basically we're seemingly going down the wrong path. Option two, eat more fruits and vegetables. One problem here, we're told to eat 5 servings of fruits and vegetables per day. There's not enough fruits and vegetables in America for everyone to eat 5 servings per day. So we have a little problem here. And also, why do we have some of these preservatives? Because food goes bad. That's why basically you go in the supermarket and buy bread, it's just full of preservatives. Because bread you make in the kitchen, it tastes great, but it only lasts a few days. So again, that option doesn't be too problematical because either we don't have enough of the fruits and vegetables, or basically food goes bad. Third option, metabolic engineering. Now, what is metabolic engineering? It's understanding how nutrients, we described earlier, how they interact with our body to make our metabolism work most efficiently. So with metabolic engineering, you're actually making processed foods, but now taking the foods and making them more efficient to make your metabolism work at peak efficiency. So that might be the way out. What we're doing today is obviously not working. And asking people to go back to the old ways, well, let's say want to go back to run the family farm, that's not going to happen either. So our option, I think, the best way to is option number 3, understand how our nutrients affect our metabolism, construct processed foods, not to make you basically sick and hungry, but to improve the quality of your metabolism, and that's how you live a longer and better life.
Excellent. Dr. Sears, I have a few follow-up questions here. So in one of the research studies I read, antibiotic use obviously wipes out your good bacteria and also the diversity of that bacteria, but many of us have to take antibiotics for various reasons. So for someone who's on an antibiotic, what do you recommend? I know we're always told to eat yogurt and dairy and things like that, but what is your recommendation for someone who does have to go on antibiotic to try and retain as much of that gut diversity as they can?
Well, remember, where do all the bacteria live? They live in the colon. Mm-hmm. So basically, you want, and what the 2 things where the bacteria are useful are work on the colon? They need fermentable fiber, and they need polyphenols. So if you're taking antibiotics, what you want to do, you want to have a diet that is now richer in fermentable fiber and polyphenols. Wait a minute, that's fruits and vegetables. Okay. So yes, so that's be your best way to reestablish basically a natural equilibrium in the gut. Well, maybe I'll just take the microbes from somebody who has a good gut and put them in my gut. It's called a fecal transplant. Oof. It works, but it doesn't work it's not very long, because basically once the microbe community you basically were born with is pretty much what you stay with. So rather than basically trying to get somebody else's microbes from their stool sample, put in your gut to repopulate it, say, no, I have a better chance of basically allowing my microbes in the gut to grow most effectively, but I have to give them fermentable fiber and I have to give them polyphenols. Without those 2, we're not going to get very far. And if I'm basically inhibiting AMPK, then it doesn't matter if I give all the fermentable fiber you need or all the polyphenols. It doesn't make much of a difference because your metabolism is not going to work very well.
Another point of clarification, Dr. Sears. So I know the gut microbiome is obviously complex. With the ultra-processed foods and the chemicals, is it that these chemicals are, playing a role with our satiety cues, so we're eating more calories and that impacts AMPK and the metabolism? Is that how it's impacting gut health, or do the chemicals themselves, do they also play a role in the microbiome?
We just don't know.
Okay.
We do know that basically they're causing us to eat more food. There's no question about that. Mm-hmm. But we don't know exactly what they're doing to other parts of our metabolism. That's a big unanswered question. So rather than those, really you have 10,000 unlicensed nuclear weapons running around in the food supply, say, try to basically make now a product that has the least amount of these new chemical entities. But the ones you're adding are ones which are important. And therefore saying it's now an engineering project. I say, I want to go to the moon. How do I do it? I've got to basically mount an engineering program to basically reprogram our metabolism to make it most effectively. And that's how we live longer.
So, and that's really where the Zone RX foods come in, Dr. Sears. So people might say, hey, these foods are still processed or ultra processed, but the way that they're working and what makes them different than these other ultra processed foods that have chemicals is that they're actually helping to optimize our metabolism with the balance of protein, carb, and fat. So they're not really characterized as ultra processed the way we think of ultra processed, if that makes sense.
Yeah, they're basically useful ultra processed foods. We're basically cracking the mysteries of metabolism. Now that we understand more about metabolism, how can we construct a food product, like a drug, to make our metabolism in each of our 30 trillion cells work better? And that's a fascinating aspect. That science gives us a clue to the future. And therefore, we basically now know enough about metabolism, how to basically take the key components, protein, carbohydrate, and fat, and the fermentable fiber, and the polyphenols, and put them all together to make that metabolism run like basically a Ferrari.